Tonight we begin with a story that sounds impossible. A man who didn't just escape from prison once or even twice, but 7 separate times. 7 occasions where he looked at bars, walls, guards, and security protocols designed to hold him forever, and quietly decided, not today. His name was rarely spoken without a mixture of frustration and grudging respect, and his life became a testament to one simple truth: some people refuse to be caged. His story is one of patience, cunning, and an almost supernatural refusal to stay captured. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of prison escapes, you might imagine Hollywood scenarios. Helicopters descending from stormy skies, explosions tearing through concrete walls, desperate men digging tunnels over months with stolen spoons and makeshift tools, the stuff of blockbuster films and breathless news coverage. Dramatic prison breaks where everything hinges on split-second timing, violence, and sheer audacity. But this man's story was different, not flashier, not more violent, just methodical, repeatable, and almost disturbingly successful. Picture this. You're locked in a cell designed by professionals whose entire job is keeping human beings contained. Every door mechanism has been tested, every window reinforced, guard rotations planned down to the minute, walls thick enough to muffle screams and stop bullets. The architecture itself is a statement. You are not leaving. Most prisoners accept this reality. They count days. They mark calendars. They dream of parole hearings and early release for good behavior. They adapt to the rhythm of institutional life, the bells and counts and lockdowns, the small privileges earned through compliance. Prison becomes not just a place but a mindset, an acceptance that for now, maybe for years, freedom is something that exists only in memory and hope. This man looked at those same walls and saw something entirely different. He saw patterns. Guard shift changes that always happened at the same time, down to the minute. Because humans are creatures of habit even when they're trying not to be. He noticed the brief moments when one guard walked away before another arrived, those 15 or 30-second gaps that weren't supposed to exist but always did. He observed which doors closed completely and which ones, worn by years of use, didn't quite latch unless you pushed them with specific pressure. He catalogued the blind spots in the prison yard, the corners where surveillance cameras couldn't quite reach, the shadows that deepened at certain hours. Where others saw a cage, he saw a system, and every system, no matter how carefully designed, has flaws. His escapes weren't about brute force or desperate improvisation. They were about information, observation, and the kind of patience that most people simply don't possess. While other inmates lifted weights or played cards, he was conducting research. Mental notes accumulated over weeks and months, stored away until the moment they became useful. The rattle of a particular keyring, the way one guard always stopped to light a cigarette at the same spot, the delivery truck that arrived every Thursday at precisely the same time like clockwork. He understood something fundamental about prisons that most people miss. They're not just physical structures, they're systems run by human beings, and human beings are predictable. They cut corners, they get complacent, they assume that because something has worked for years, it will keep working forever, and he was willing to wait for the moment when all those small observations, all those mental notes, aligned into a single opportunity. This wasn't luck. It wasn't some mystical gift for escaping. It was intelligence applied with surgical precision to a problem most people never even tried to solve. While Hollywood showed prisoners frantically digging or fighting their way out, this man simply watched, learned, and waited until the prison itself showed him the way out. The question wasn't whether he could escape. The question was when he would do it next, and how the authorities, despite all their training and technology and reinforced steel, would somehow let it happen again. But to understand how someone becomes this skilled at escaping, we need to understand who he was before the first lock ever closed behind him. Mark DeFries didn't come into the world planning to become a legend among prison escapees. Born on August 18, 1960 in rural Florida, his early life was quiet, unremarkable, shaped by the kind of ordinary circumstances that produce ordinary people. His father worked with tools, building and fixing things with his hands. Young Mark inherited that fascination with how things worked, but in him it became something more intense, something almost obsessive. By the age of 6, Mark could disassemble a mechanical watch, study its tiny gears and springs with the focused attention of a master craftsman, and put it back together perfectly, not approximately, perfectly. While other children played with toys, Mark played with mechanisms, understanding them in ways that seemed almost instinctive. He didn't just see objects, he saw systems, patterns, the relationships between moving parts. Eventually there was nothing he couldn't repair. Radios, engines, locks, you name it. If it had moving parts, Mark could figure it out. But understanding machines is different from understanding people. Mark struggled socially. He stood out not in the charismatic way that wins friends, but in the awkward way that marks you as different. Conversations that came naturally to others felt like puzzles he couldn't quite solve. Social cues that seemed obvious to everyone else passed right by him. He was brilliant with his hands, patient with mechanical problems, but the unspoken rules of human interaction remained frustratingly opaque. At 19, Mark married. He and his new wife were driving along the Florida Panhandle, working their way west to start fresh somewhere new, when news reached them that his father had died suddenly. Mark turned the car around immediately. There were funeral arrangements to handle, family to see, and one other matter: his father's tools. In his will, Mark's father had left his collection of work tools to his son. It made sense. Mark had grown up around those tools, learned his craft with them, understood their value not just in dollars but in memory and meaning. They were his inheritance, the only thing his father had of real worth to pass down. So Mark, grieving and practical, went to collect them. Here's where ordinary circumstances twisted into something that would define the rest of his life. The will hadn't completed probate yet. Legally, technically, those tools still belonged to the estate, not to Mark. His stepmother, for reasons that remain unclear, whether out of spite or some misguided sense of legal propriety, called the police. When the officers arrived to arrest him for theft, Mark panicked. He ran. And because this was rural Florida, and because fear makes people do irrational things, he grabbed a gun on his way out the door. He never fired it, never pointed it at anyone, never even brandished it in a threatening way, but he had it. And in the eyes of the law, that transformed a probate dispute into something far more serious. Mark was arrested, charged, and in 1980 sentenced to 4 years in prison. 4 years for taking tools his own father had wanted him to have. 4 years for a panicked flight that hurt no one. 4 years that somehow, through a series of escalating decisions and mounting consequences, would eventually stretch into 34 years. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. When the prison gates closed behind Mark DeFriest for the first time, he was 20 years old, married, skilled with his hands, and facing a world he didn't fully understand. The Florida Correctional system in the early 1980s wasn't designed for rehabilitation. It was designed for punishment, for warehousing the unwanted, for breaking down anyone who thought they were special or clever or deserving of anything beyond the concrete walls and steel bars that defined their new reality. Most inmates adapted by becoming smaller, quieter, more compliant. They learned the rules, kept their heads down, counted the days until release. Prison was something to endure, to survive, to get through with as little friction as possible. Mark looked at those bars and started counting the seconds between guard rotations. He couldn't help himself. It was the same instinct that had drawn him to disassemble watches as a child, the same drive to understand systems and find the weak points, the places where things didn't quite fit together properly. Prison wasn't just a cage to him. It was the most complex mechanism he'd ever encountered, and like every mechanism, it had flaws. He watched. Quietly, patiently, he observed how the prison operated. Guard shift changes happened at specific times, but the actual handoff, the moment when one guard left their post and another took over, varied by a few seconds each time. Sometimes 15 seconds, sometimes 30. Small gaps that weren't supposed to exist but did because humans, even trained professionals, are creatures of habit and fatigue. He noticed which doors closed all the way and which ones didn't unless you pushed them with exactly the right pressure. He catalogued the blind spots in the yard, the corners where cameras couldn't quite reach, the shadows that deepened at certain hours depending on the season and the angle of the sun. He memorized the rattle of different key rings, learning to identify which guard was approaching by sound alone. Some guards were meticulous, checking locks twice, following procedures exactly. Others were tired, bored, going through motions they'd repeated 10,000 times before. And in that boredom, in that routine, were openings. Other inmates thought Mark was quiet, maybe a little odd, maybe slow. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. He didn't play cards or lift weights or join the usual social groups that formed in prison. He just watched, absorbed information, built a mental map of the facility that was probably more detailed than the blueprints the architects had drawn. His intelligence, which had manifested as mechanical aptitude on the outside, found a new application behind bars. Every rule, every procedure, every security measure was just another system to understand. And Mark was very, very good at understanding systems. What the guards didn't know, what they couldn't have guessed, was that Mark wasn't struggling to adapt to prison life. He was studying it. Every day was another data point, another observation added to a growing collection of knowledge about how this particular machine worked, and, more importantly, where it didn't work quite right. Prison psychologists would later describe Mark as having significant social deficits. 5 out of 6 psychiatrists who evaluated him deemed him mentally ill, incompetent even. They saw his difficulty reading social cues, his fixation on mechanical problems, his inability to navigate the unspoken hierarchies and power dynamics that other inmates understood instinctively. What they mistook for incompetence was actually a different kind of intelligence, one that didn't operate on social wavelengths, but thrived on pattern recognition and mechanical logic. Mark couldn't charm his way through conversations or manipulate guards with social engineering, but he could spend 6 months memorizing the shape of a key from brief glimpses as a guard walked past his cell, then replicate it from memory using whatever material he could find. That wasn't mental illness. That was genius applied in a direction no one expected. The truth is, Mark de Frist was probably somewhere on the autism spectrum, though he would go decades before anyone properly recognized it. His brain worked differently, processing information through systems and patterns rather than social intuition. In the outside world, this made him awkward, isolated, the kid who understood machines better than people. In prison, it made him dangerous in ways the authorities were completely unprepared for. As his first months in custody stretched into a year, Mark had accumulated more knowledge about the prison's operations than some of the guards who worked there. He knew schedules, procedures, weak points, and opportunities. He knew exactly how long it took for backup to arrive if an alarm was triggered. He knew which parts of the fence were most vulnerable, which doors could be compromised, which protocols were followed strictly and which were often ignored. He wasn't planning an escape out of desperation or rage. He was engineering one with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to repairing watches. Every piece had to fit, every timing had to align. And when the moment came, when all those observations finally coalesced into a single viable opportunity, he would be ready. The guards saw a quiet inmate serving his time. What they didn't see was a man who had turned prison itself into a puzzle he was determined to solve. Not because he was a hardened criminal or a violent threat, but because staying caged, accepting that these walls were permanent, went against everything his brain was wired to do. Mark de Frist wasn't counting days until release. He was counting seconds until opportunity. What the guards didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that those quiet early days of observation were anything but idle. They were reconnaissance, and the first escape, the one that would set off a pattern lasting decades, was already taking shape in his mind. Florida State Hospital in Chattahoochee wasn't technically a prison. It was a psychiatric facility, a sprawling compound of aging buildings set in the humid panhandle of northern Florida, where the air hung thick even in winter, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with something older, mustier, harder to name. The place had been built decades earlier to house the mentally ill, the criminally insane, the people society didn't quite know what to do with. By the time Mark de Frist arrived in 1980, it was overcrowded, understaffed, and operating under the kind of bureaucratic inertia that keeps broken systems running long past their expiration date. To most inmates, Chattahoochee was simply another cage. Different walls, same result. To Mark, it was a laboratory. The building itself was an architectural hodgepodge, additions tacked onto the original structure over the years like layers of scar tissue. Some wings dated back to the 1930s, with high ceilings, large windows covered in heavy wire mesh, and floors that echoed with every footstep. Newer sections featured the kind of utilitarian design that prioritized cost over humanity. Narrow hallways with fluorescent lighting that hummed constantly. Rooms painted institutional beige that seemed to absorb hope. Security was different here than it would be in a traditional prison. The facility housed people who were deemed mentally unfit, dangerous to themselves or others, in need of treatment rather than simple punishment. That meant more staff on duty, nurses and orderlies and doctors making rounds, but also meant protocols that were sometimes looser, more focused on preventing self-harm than preventing escape. After all, where were mentally ill patients going to go? Mark noticed everything. The doors, for instance. Most locked automatically when closed, heavy mechanisms clicking into place with a satisfying metallic thunk. But some of the older doors, particularly in the wings that hadn't been renovated in decades, required manual locking. A staff member had to turn a key, physically engage the bolt. And in the chaos of shift changes, in the rushed handoffs between exhausted workers at the end of a long shifts, sometimes that manual locking didn't happen quite the way it was supposed to. He watched the orderlies, tracking their routines with the same focused attention he'd once given to watch mechanisms. Morning medication rounds started at 7, moving ward by ward in a predictable pattern. Lunch arrived at noon, delivered on metal carts that squeaked their way down the corridors. Evening checks happened every 2 hours after lights out, flashlights sweeping across sleeping forms, searching for movement, trouble, anything that required intervention. But between those scheduled moments, there were gaps. Minutes when hallways stood empty, blind corners where no one could see you unless they walked right up to them. A service entrance used by deliveries that opened onto a loading dock, rarely monitored because who would think to watch the back door of a psychiatric hospital? The pharmacy was located in the central building, a locked room behind a counter where medications were prepared and distributed. Mark had been assigned to help with cleaning duties, mopping floors, emptying trash, the kind of menial work given to inmates who seemed compliant and harmless. He was neither, but he played the part well enough. Quiet Mark, cooperative Mark. Mark who kept his head down and did what he was told. While he mopped, he watched. The pharmacy had multiple keys. Some staff members were meticulous about securing them, keeping them on retractable chains attached to their belts, never letting them out of sight. Others were less careful, setting them on the counter while they filled prescriptions, sometimes walking away for a moment to retrieve files or answer questions. In those moments, Mark's eyes tracked every detail. The length of each key, the pattern of teeth along the edge, the depth of each cut. He wasn't just looking. He was memorizing, encoding the information the way some people memorize phone numbers or addresses. He could have drawn any of those keys from memory, could have told you which one opened which door, which cabinet, which controlled access to the medications themselves, including the LSD-25 that sat in a secured drawer, used occasionally in experimental psychiatric treatments that were still legal in some facilities at the time. The other patients didn't interest Mark much. Some screamed, some rocked back and forth, some sat in medicated stupors, barely present in their own bodies. A few tried to engage him in conversation, but Mark's social difficulties, the same traits that had isolated him his whole life, actually worked in his favour here. He seemed unremarkable, just another lost soul shuffling through the institutional routine. What the staff didn't understand was that Mark's brain, the same brain that struggled with emotional cues and social niceties, excelled at pattern recognition. He could see systems the way most people saw faces, intuitively, immediately, with a clarity that felt almost instinctive. And Chattahoochee, for all its locked doors and security protocols, was just another system. Complex, certainly, but not unbreakable. The perimeter fence was 12 feet high, chain link topped with razor wire, running the circumference of the facility grounds. Guard towers stood at the corners, but they weren't always manned, especially during shift changes when personnel numbers dipped. The main gate required authorized vehicles to check in and out, but there was a smaller maintenance gate on the eastern side used by groundskeepers and repair crews that opened with a simple padlock. Not electronic, not sophisticated. Just a brass padlock that could be picked by anyone with basic knowledge and a piece of stiff wire. Mark had both. The parking lot beyond the fence held staff vehicles, dozens of cars belonging to nurses, doctors, administrative workers. Getting over the fence would be the hard part, but once you were outside the compound, blending in became exponentially easier. You weren't an escapee if you were sitting in a car, driving calmly toward the exit. You were just another person leaving work at the end of a shift. He spent a month absorbing information, learning schedules, identifying weaknesses, building the mental blueprint that would guide his first attempt. Other inmates saw the days passing, Mark saw opportunities accumulating, data points connecting, a picture emerging of how the impossible might become possible. At night, lying on his narrow bed in the ward, listening to the sounds of other patients moving restlessly in their sleep, Mark's mind didn't rest. It calculated, planned, refined. The pharmaceutical angle offered one approach. If staff were impaired, distracted, the chaos would create openings, but it was risky. Too many variables, too much that could go wrong before he reached the fence. Better to identify a cleaner path, a moment when multiple factors aligned, when the maintenance gate would be accessible, when guard tower visibility was reduced, when a specific vehicle would be parked close enough to the fence that hot wiring it became feasible. Because Mark could hotwire anything. It was just another mechanism, another system of wires and connections that followed logical patterns. You didn't need a key if you understood how the ignition worked, if you could bypass the steering column lock, if your fingers were patient and precise enough to make the right connections. Some of the other inmates, the ones who'd been at Chattahoochee longer, occasionally talked about escape. It was fantasy talk, idle dreaming, the kind of thing people discussed to pass time without any real intention behind it. The walls were too high, they said, the guards too watchful, the consequences too severe. Where would you even go? Mark listened but said little. He didn't need companions for what he was planning. Partnership meant risk, meant relying on someone else's discretion, someone else's nerve. And Mark had learned long ago that the only person he could really trust was himself. By the end of his first month at Chattahoochee, Mark DeFrest had compiled more operational intelligence about the facility than probably existed in any official security manual. He knew things the administrators didn't know, had identified vulnerabilities that had gone unnoticed for years. The psychiatric hospital, designed to hold people who couldn't escape their own minds, was completely unprepared for someone who saw their walls as just another puzzle waiting to be solved. And then, after 30 days of patient observation, after accumulating knowledge like a craftsman gathering tools, he made his move. The plan, such as it was, began on a Tuesday morning in early 1981. The weather outside was typical for the Florida Panhandle, humid and overcast, the kind of grey that made everything inside the facility feel even more claustrophobic than usual. Mark had watched the staff coffee pot for weeks, noting who drank from it, when they refilled it, how long it sat unattended on the counter in the staff break room. Getting access to the pharmacy had been surprisingly easy. His cleaning duties gave him legitimate reasons to be in that area, mopping floors, emptying trash bins, restocking paper towels. Over time, the staff stopped really seeing him. He became part of the background, just another quiet inmate doing his assigned work, no threat, no concern, barely worth a second glance. The LSD-25 sat in a locked drawer, but Mark had memorized which key opened it during one of his observation sessions. When the pharmacist stepped away to take a phone call, leaving her keyring on the counter for just a moment, Mark moved. Not frantically, not obviously. Just a smooth, practiced motion, the kind that comes from having visualized the exact sequence of movements dozens of times beforehand. The vial was small, glass, holding enough liquid to dose multiple patients for experimental psychiatric treatments. Mark didn't take the whole thing. That would be noticed immediately. Instead, he transferred a portion into a small container he'd fashioned from a discarded medicine cup, sealed it, and returned the original vial to its proper place. The entire operation took perhaps 20 seconds. The pharmacist returned to her desk none the wiser. Carrying the LSD through the facility required nerve. If anyone searched him, if anyone asked what he was doing, the whole plan would collapse before it even began. But no one did. He was just Mark, shuffling back to his ward, mop bucket in hand, looking like he belonged exactly where he was. The staff break room emptied round mid-morning when nurses and orderlies scattered to handle medication rounds and patient check-ins. The coffee pot sat on its warmer, half full, probably brewed an hour earlier and now slightly bitter from sitting too long. Mark had perhaps 3 minutes before someone would return. He emptied the vial into the pot, watched the liquid disappear into the dark coffee, stirred it gently with a wooden stick he'd brought for exactly this purpose. The smell didn't change. The colour remained the same murky brown. There was no way to tell, just by looking, that the coffee now contained enough LSD to send everyone who drank it on an unexpected and deeply unpleasant journey. Then he walked away, returned to his cleaning duties and waited. It took about 40 minutes. The first screams came from the nurse's station. A woman's voice, high and panicked, shouting about colours bleeding from the walls, about her hands melting, about something crawling across the ceiling that no one else could see. Then another voice joined her, a male orderly convinced that the floor was breathing, that the tiles were rising and falling like the chest of some enormous sleeping creature. Chaos spread faster than Mark had anticipated. Within minutes, half the staff on duty were experiencing full-blown hallucinogenic episodes. Some tried to keep working, fighting, through the distortions with grim determination that only made things worse. Others simply collapsed, overwhelmed by perceptions their brains couldn't process. One nurse sat on the floor weeping, convinced she was dissolving into the linoleum. This was the moment. The window when security protocols would fragment, when normal supervision would break down, when the facility's orderly routines would shatter into something approximating pandemonium. Mark moved toward the eastern perimeter, walking with purpose but not running. Running drew attention. Running said escape, but walking, even walking with clear direction, could pass for an inmate being moved from one area to another, especially in the confusion now swallowing the facility whole. He'd almost reached the maintenance gate when someone noticed. Not one of the incapacitated staff, but a security guard who'd been in a different building, away from the poisoned coffee, now responding to the emergency calls crackling over his radio. The guard saw Mark near the fence, and his training kicked in immediately. "Stop! Get back to your ward!" Mark didn't stop. He'd come too far, was too close to the fence, had waited too long planning this moment to let it slip away now. He broke into a run, footsteps pounding across the grass, heading straight for the chain-link barrier that separated him from the parking lot beyond. Behind him, the guard's radio erupted with overlapping voices, everyone trying to report the crisis simultaneously, creating a wall of static and confusion. More security would be coming. Lockdown protocols would engage. The window was closing fast. The fence was 12 feet of chain link topped with coils of razor wire, but Mark had identified his spot weeks ago. A section near the maintenance gate where the wire had been installed slightly higher than the rest, leaving a few precious inches of clearance. Not much, but enough for someone desperate and precise. He hit the fence at full speed and climbed. His hands found purchase on the metal diamonds, his feet pushing him upward with a speed born from absolute necessity. The fence rattled and swayed under his weight. 10 feet. 11 feet. The razor wire loomed above him, glinting dully in the grey morning light. This was the part he'd visualised but never practised. You couldn't practice scaling a fence topped with razor wire. You either did it or you didn't. Hesitation meant capture. Overthinking meant failure. Mark reached the top, found the gap he'd spotted during his observations and threw himself over. Not cleanly. The wire caught his shirt, tore fabric, drew a line of blood across his forearm. But he was over, falling, hitting the ground on the other side with a jarring impact that knocked the wind from his lungs. No time to recover. He was up and running before his body had fully registered the pain, sprinting across the parking lot toward the vehicles he'd been watching for weeks. A blue sedan, older model, the kind with simple wiring that anyone with basic mechanical knowledge could bypass. Hot wiring a car isn't as fast as movies make it look. Even when you know what you're doing, even when you've done it before, it takes precious seconds. Mark's hands worked under the steering column, fingers finding the right wires by touch, stripping insulation with his teeth, making the connections that would bypass the ignition. The engine turned over, coughed, caught. He was in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, foot on the gas, pulling out of the parking spot as security guards burst through the facility's main entrance. They were shouting, pointing, some of them still visibly affected by the LSD, moving with the uncertain coordination of people whose reality had become unreliable. Mark drove. Not fast enough to attract police attention on the roads beyond the hospital, but fast enough to put distance between himself and Chattahoochee. Every mile was a small victory. Every minute of freedom was something he hadn't felt since the first prison door had closed behind him months earlier. He made it 3 hours and roughly 40 miles before running out of gas on a rural highway outside Marianna. Standing beside the stalled vehicle, watching the sun sink lower in the Florida sky, Mark must have realized that preparation could only take you so far. You could plan the escape perfectly and still be undone by something as simple as forgetting to check the fuel gauge. The police found him within an hour. He didn't resist, didn't run, just stood there beside the dead car, hands at his sides, as the officers approached with weapons drawn. His first escape had lasted less than half a day. And yet, in those few hours of freedom, Mark had proved something to himself that would shape everything that followed. Prison walls, psychiatric hospital fences, security protocols, they were all just mechanisms, and mechanisms could be defeated by someone patient enough to study them, clever enough to exploit their weaknesses. The guards learned to watch him more carefully after that. Mark learned something else entirely. He learned they always made the same mistakes. If you thought the authorities would have learned their lesson after the first escape, you'd be giving them too much credit. Mark was transferred to Bay County Jail, a facility that promised tighter security and closer supervision. The warden assured everyone that DeFrist would be watched carefully, that the incident at Chattahoochee had been an anomaly, that their protocols were sound enough to hold even the most resourceful inmates. Within 6 weeks, Mark was studying their patterns again. Bay County Jail wasn't a psychiatric hospital. It was a proper detention facility, all concrete and steel, built in the 1960s with the kind of institutional grimness that announced its purpose from 100 yards away. The cells were smaller than at Chattahoochee, the bars thicker, security ostensibly more rigorous. Guards conducted. Head counts multiple times per shift. Surveillance cameras covered the main corridors. The whole operation ran on procedures designed to prevent exactly what Mark was already planning. But procedures are only as good as the people following them, and people, no matter how well trained, fall into routines. Comfortable routines. Predictable routines. The evening shift change happened at 6 p.m. every day, not approximately 6, exactly 6. The departing guards would gather near the main security desk to hand off their reports, discuss any issues from their shift, sometimes lingering for a few minutes to finish conversations or joke about plans for the night. During those minutes, the incoming guards were still settling in, checking equipment, reviewing notes. There was overlap, yes, but there were also moments when attention divided, when eyes looked at paperwork instead of cell blocks, when the machinery of institutional routine created tiny gaps in observation. Mark watched those gaps like a jeweller examining a diamond for flaws. The cells at Bay County had a peculiar design feature that probably seemed insignificant to the architects who'd approved them. The doors, heavy steel affairs that locked with mechanical bolts controlled from a central panel, had a slight manufacturing defect. Not all of them, just a few, including the one that secured Mark's cell. When the bolt engaged, it went almost all the way into the strike plate, but not quite fully. Perhaps a 1/16th of an inch short of where it should have seated completely. Under normal circumstances, that 1/16th of an inch made no difference. The door held. Pressure from the inside accomplished nothing. The mechanism was solid enough for any reasonable definition of secure. But Mark wasn't interested in reasonable definitions. He'd found, during one of his careful examinations while pretending to sleep, that if you applied pressure at exactly the right angle, at exactly the right point on the door frame, while simultaneously pushing the door itself in a specific direction, that 1/16th of an inch became relevant. The bolt would cant slightly in its housing, not enough to disengage, not enough to open the door, but enough to create a microscopic amount of play in the mechanism. Over the course of 3 weeks, Mark worked on that play, not obviously, not in ways that would be visible during inspections, just gentle, patient pressure, applied in moments when guards weren't directly observing him. Metal fatigues under repeated stress. Microscopic amounts of wear accumulate. What starts as a 1/16th of an inch can become an 1/8, then a 1/4, given enough time and enough precise application of force. The tool he used was a piece of wire he'd scavenged from a cleaning brush. Nothing sophisticated, nothing that would register as a weapon or contraband. Just a length of stiff wire that could be hidden easily, that wouldn't attract attention during the cursory searches guards conducted. The night he chose for his second escape was a Friday. Fridays meant shift changes took slightly longer, guards eager to start their weekends lingering a bit more at handoff, Conversations running a few extra minutes. Those extra minutes mattered. At 6:07 p.m., while the security desk buzzed with departing and arriving guards comparing notes, Mark worked the wire into the gap he'd carefully created over weeks of patient manipulation. The bolt resisted, held. The door remained secure. He adjusted the angle, applied pressure differently, felt for the spot where metal would yield just enough. The bolt shifted, not fully disengaging, but moving backward in its housing by a fraction of an inch, then another fraction. The door remained closed, but it was no longer locked in any meaningful sense. One firm push would open it. Mark waited, counted seconds, listened to the voices from the guard station, heard someone laugh about weekend plans, heard footsteps moving away down the corridor. He pushed. The door swung open with a soft creak that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet cell block, but was actually barely audible beyond his immediate vicinity. Other inmates in neighbouring cells didn't stir. Most were sleeping or watching the small television mounted on the far wall. The evening news was on, something about interest rates and the economy, boring enough that no one was paying particular attention. Mark stepped into the corridor wearing the clothes he'd been issued, looking no different than he had at any other moment during his incarceration. This wasn't like Chattahoochee where chaos provided cover. This required something else, confidence, the appearance of legitimacy, the kind of brazen normalcy that makes people assume you belong exactly where you are. The corridor led toward the loading dock, an area where supplies were delivered and trash was removed. It wasn't heavily monitored because who would escape through the garbage? But Mark had noticed that deliveries came on Fridays around 6:30, and that the loading dock door was often left unlocked during those brief windows to accommodate the delivery drivers. He walked, not slowly enough to seem suspicious, not fast enough to attract attention, just a steady, purposeful stride that suggested someone with legitimate business somewhere. A guard passed him in the hallway, made eye contact, nodded slightly. Mark nodded back and kept walking. Years later, that guard would be asked why he didn't stop defreezed, why he didn't question an inmate walking freely through areas that should have been restricted. His answer was simple and damning. He looked like he was supposed to be there. The loading dock was exactly where Mark had observed it during his weeks of surveillance, accessible through a service corridor that smelled of industrial cleaner and aging concrete. The door stood propped open, waiting for the delivery truck that would arrive in approximately 12 minutes. Mark didn't wait for the truck. He walked through the door, across the loading area and down the short ramp to ground level. The fence surrounding the facility rose 15 feet high, but the loading area was outside that perimeter, separated from the main compound for security reasons that probably made sense on paper, but created exactly the kind of vulnerability Mark had learned to identify. A dumpster sat against the fence. Climbing it gave him the height he needed to reach the top of the chain link. No razor wire here, just smooth metal top rail. He was over in seconds, landing in an alley that ran behind the jail, filled with the usual detritus of urban neglect, broken pallets, empty bottles, weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. This time he didn't try to steal a car. That had been his mistake before, choosing a vehicle that would eventually run out of gas, that tied him to a specific location when it failed. This time he walked. Blended into the evening foot traffic of a small Florida town where a young man in plain clothes attracted no particular attention. He made it 2 full days before being picked up at a bus station in Pensacola, ticket in hand for Mobile, Alabama, so close to crossing state lines to disappearing into a larger anonymity. But someone recognized him from a wanted poster, made a call, and suddenly Mark was surrounded by officers with drawn weapons who weren't taking any chances this time. 2 escapes, each one more refined than the last, each one teaching him something new about security systems, about human psychology, about the distance between locked up and free. The authorities were learning too, though slower than Mark was. They were learning that this quiet, awkward young man with the mechanical genius was unlike any prisoner they'd dealt with before, that watching him carefully wasn't enough, that conventional security measures wouldn't hold him. But Mark was already thinking about escape number 3. By the time Mark DeFrist was imprisoned for the 3rd time, newspapers were starting to pay attention. Small items at first, buried in local crime sections, brief mentions of the inmate who kept walking away from supposedly secure facilities. But editors were beginning to notice a pattern, and patterns make for good copy. Headlines whispered about the man who couldn't be held, the escape artist who made Florida's correction system look increasingly incompetent with each successful breakout. And Mark, whether he enjoyed the attention or not, was about to give them his most audacious performance yet. This time he wasn't in a psychiatric hospital or a county jail. The Florida Department of Corrections had transferred him to a medium security facility near Tallahassee, a sprawling complex of concrete buildings surrounded by double fencing, razor wire, and guard towers positioned at regular intervals. The place had been designed in the 1970s using modern security principles, lessons learned from decades of prison escapes nationwide. Everything about it suggested permanence, control, the triumph of institutional order over individual will. The administrators felt confident. They'd studied Mark's previous escapes, implemented new procedures specifically designed to counter his methods, extra surveillance on cleaning duties, keys secured on retractable chains, door inspections twice per shift. They even rotated guard schedules randomly to prevent pattern recognition. What they hadn't accounted for was memory. Mark's brain, that strange mechanical instrument that struggled with social cues but excelled at spatial relationships and visual processing, could memorize the shape of a key from a single glimpse. Not just approximately, exactly. The depth of each cut, the spacing between teeth, the overall length and thickness. He could see a key hanging from a guard's belt as they walked past his cell, process that visual information in the second or two it remained in view, and store it with photographic precision. Over 3 months he collected mental images of 7 different keys. Each one opened something specific: a storage closet, an administrative office, the maintenance shed where tools were kept, the side gate used by delivery trucks. Mark didn't need to hold them or trace them, he just needed to see them, and his brain did the rest, encoding the information like a camera capturing photographs. The fabrication process was pure genius applied to limited resources. Mark had access to nothing that resembled proper metalworking tools. No files, no grinders, no way to cut or shape steel with any precision. What he did have was patience, ingenuity, and materials that no one considered dangerous. Pieces of metal torn from the frame of his bunk, thin enough to be workable, strong enough to hold form, scraps of aluminum foil from meal trays layered and compressed to add rigidity, tiny fragments of harder metal scavenged from broken fixtures, anything that could be slowly ground down using concrete walls and floor as abrasive surfaces. The work took weeks, rubbing metal against concrete in sessions so brief and quiet that guards walking past would hear nothing unusual, shaping each piece according to the images stored in his memory, checking and rechecking against the mental template, making microscopic adjustments until the key that existed in his mind began to exist in his hands. By early 1982, Mark possessed 7 working keys, each one carefully hidden in different locations throughout his cell. None of them were perfect. They looked rough, handmade, obviously crafted rather than manufactured. But they didn't need to be beautiful. They just needed to work. The escape itself happened on a Wednesday afternoon, a time when most inmates were in the recreation yard or attending mandatory programming. Mark had complained of illness that morning, stayed back in his cell, a decision that aroused no particular suspicion because Mark wasn't the type to cause trouble during recreation time. Anyway, at 2:15 p.m, during a shift change window he'd been timing for months, Mark used his first key to open his cell door. The lock resisted briefly, the handmade key catching on imperfections in the mechanism, but then the bolt slid back with a quiet click that might have been the most satisfying sound he'd ever heard. He moved through the facility like a man who belonged there, confident, purposeful. Used his second key to access a storage closet, changed into maintenance coveralls he'd observed being stored there weeks earlier. Used his third key to enter the administrative wing, walking past offices where staff worked at desks, too focused on paperwork to question the maintenance worker moving through their space. The 4th key opened the tool shed. The 5th opened the service gate. The 6th opened a guard station that was supposed to be unmanned during this particular 15-minute window. It was. Mark walked out through a door that led to a delivery area outside the main perimeter. Behind him, the prison carried on its routines, unaware that one of its most notorious inmates had just navigated 6 locked doors, using keys he'd crafted from bunk frames and meal tray scraps. This time he stayed free for 5 days. 5 days of moving through northern Florida, using his mechanical skills to find odd jobs, sleeping rough, avoiding areas where he might be recognized. He was eventually picked up at a truck stop outside Jacksonville, trying to hitch a ride north, hoping to disappear into the anonymity of a larger city. But those 5 days were enough for the story to spread, enough for newspaper reporters to start asking uncomfortable questions about how a prison built on modern security principles had been defeated by handmade keys, enough for Mark DeFries to transform from a local problem into a statewide phenomenon. The Miami Herald ran a feature story. The Tampa Bay Times interviewed corrections officials who struggled to explain how this had happened. Television news picked up the story, showing Mark's mugshot, recounting his escape history, using phrases like modern Houdini and master escape artist. Public opinion split in fascinating ways. Some people saw Mark as a dangerous criminal who needed to be locked up permanently, who'd proven through repeated escapes that he couldn't be trusted with any degree of freedom. Others saw him as something different, a kind of underdog folk hero, someone whose original crime, taking his father's tools, seemed so minor compared to the growing consequences. Letters arrived at the governor's office, at newspapers, some demanding harsher treatment, others asking for leniency, forgiveness, recognition that something had gone terribly wrong in how the system had handled this young man. The corrections department responded with bureaucratic fury. New protocols were implemented, security assessments conducted. Mark was classified as a maximum escape risk, moved to increasingly restrictive. Housing, subjected to enhanced monitoring that would have been considered excessive for violent offenders. But the damage to their reputation was done. Mark DeFries had made them look like idiots, and in the pride-driven world of institutional corrections, that was an unforgivable sin. 3 escapes, each one more sophisticated than the last, each one proving that Mark's brain, however poorly adapted for normal social interaction, was perfectly evolved for solving the specific problem of how to defeat locks, guards, and walls. He wasn't just escaping anymore, he was making a statement, sending a message that echoed through every corrections facility in Florida. Your security is theatre, your locks are suggestions, and some people will never stop trying to be free. What the public saw as entertainment, the authorities saw as embarrassment. An embarrassment in the criminal justice system demands response. If there was one escape that showcased Mark DeFries' genius, it was the 4th. By now, he'd been transferred to Florida State Prison, a facility designed specifically to hold the state's most dangerous and escape-prone inmates. This wasn't some county jail with outdated security measures or a medium-security facility built on the cheap. This was Rayford, the prison that inspired Lynyrd Skynyrd's song about men who couldn't go back, who'd rather die than return to those walls. The guards were more alert, the protocols stricter, the walls higher and topped with enough razor wire to shred anyone foolish enough to attempt to climb. Mark studied it anyway. Florida State Prison sat in rural Bradford County, surrounded by flat scrubland that offered no natural cover for miles in any direction. Escape on foot was essentially impossible. You'd be visible from the guard towers long before you reached anything resembling concealment. The perimeter consisted of 2 parallel chain-link fences, each 18 feet high, separated by a no-man's land filled with sensor cables that would trigger alarms if disturbed. Guard towers staffed 24 hours, equipped with searchlights and rifles. The main gate was a vehicle sally port with multiple checkpoints, each requiring separate authorization. Inside, the security was even more impressive. Mark had been classified as maximum escape risk, which meant he was held in a special unit with enhanced monitoring. His cell was searched daily, sometimes twice daily. Guards looking for contraband, tools, anything that might facilitate an escape. He was strip-searched after any time spent outside his cell. His movements were logged, tracked, analysed for patterns. The guards thought they'd finally built a cage strong enough to hold him. They'd underestimated how closely Mark paid attention to things that weren't supposed to matter. The facility had been constructed in stages over decades, with newer sections added to older buildings, creating architectural inconsistencies that security planners probably thought were irrelevant. In one area, where old met new, the ventilation system included ductwork that dated to the original 1960s construction. It wasn't large, nothing like the spacious ducts you see in movies where people crawl around freely. These were 10-inch square metal channels, barely wide enough for a human torso, assuming that torso belonged to someone willing to compress themselves into spaces that seemed anatomically impossible. Most people would look at a 10-inch duct and think, no way, not a chance. Humans don't fit through openings that small. Mark looked at it and started calculating angles. The duct ran from the ventilation room, which he had access to during his assigned cleaning duties, up through the ceiling and eventually to the roof. Getting into the duct required removing a metal grate secured by 4 screws. The screws were designed to resist tampering, special security hardware that couldn't be removed with standard tools. But Mark had noticed that one particular guard during searches of the ventilation room would rest his hand on that grate while talking on his radio. Over weeks, that repeated pressure had slightly loosened one screw, just barely, microscopically, but enough. Mark worked on that screw for 3 weeks. Not with tools, he had none. With pressure applied during the brief moments when no one was watching, tiny incremental rotations that moved it perhaps a 1/16th of a turn each time. The work was agonizingly slow, but Mark had learned that patience was the most valuable tool an escape artist could possess. When the first screw finally came free, the others followed more easily, loosened by the change in structural tension. Mark removed the grate during a cleaning session, replaced it carefully before the next inspection, and began his study of the ductwork itself. The space was claustrophobic in ways that would trigger panic in most people. Dark, narrow, sharp metal edges waiting to tear skin or clothing. No room to turn around once you entered, meaning you either went forward or backed out the way you came. The duct ran for approximately 40 feet before reaching the roof access point, climbing at a steep angle that meant fighting gravity the entire way. Mark tested his ability to fit by practicing during the brief windows when he was alone in the ventilation room. Shoulders compressed, arms extended forward, using fingers and toes to inch upward against smooth metal surfaces that offered almost no purchase. It took him 15 minutes to navigate 10 feet during his trial run, and that was with the mental security of knowing he could back out if necessary. On the night of the escape, backing out wasn't an option. He'd timed it for a shift change, the same strategy that had worked before, but this time complicated by the enhanced security protocols. Guards did head counts every 30 minutes in his unit. That meant he had less than 30 minutes to remove the grate, enter the duct, navigate 40 feet of tight, metal channel, reach the roof, cross the roof to a blind spot between guard tower sightlines, and somehow get over 2 18-foot fences before the alarm sounded. The mathematics of the situation were brutal, but Mark had spent months mapping every element, timing every component, and he believed it was possible. He removed the grate at 10:47 p.m., squeezed into the duct at 10:48. The metal was cold against his skin, sharp edges catching on his clothing almost immediately. He pulled himself forward using fingers hooked into seams where sections of ductwork joined, toes pushing against any imperfection in the surface. The angle was steeper than he'd estimated during practice, maybe 35 degrees instead of 30. Each foot gained required significant effort, muscles straining, breath coming in shallow gasps in the confined space. 10 feet, 20 feet. Halfway there, and his shirt had torn in 3 places, blood seeping from cuts on his shoulders and ribs where the metal had won small victories. 30 feet, and he could see the faint outline of the roof access point above. Moonlight filtering through gaps in the vent cover. 40 feet. He'd made it. The roof access vent had a simple latch on the exterior, designed to be opened from outside for the maintenance. From inside, it was secured by gravity and friction. Mark braced himself in the narrow space and pushed upward with everything he had. The vent cover resisted, held, then suddenly gave way with a metallic screech that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. He was on the roof at 11:13, 26 minutes since he'd left his cell, 4 minutes before the next head count would discover him missing. What happened next would be debated for years in prison security conferences and training sessions. Mark had no tools, no rope, no equipment of any kind. The 2 fences stood between him and freedom, separated by 15 feet of monitored ground, each topped with coils of razor wire. Climbing them in the traditional sense was impossible. Instead, Mark used the roof itself. A section of the building extended close to the outer fence, close enough that a desperate person might conceivably jump the distance. Not safely, not without risk of serious injury or death, but possibly. He jumped at 11:16, cleared the first fence entirely, his trajectory carrying him over the razor wire with inches to spare, landed hard on the ground between fences, rolled, absorbed the impact in a way that probably broke or at least seriously bruised several ribs, didn't stop moving, sprinted to the second fence while alarms began their delayed scream behind him, climbed despite the pain, despite the razor wire that tore new cuts across his arms and legs, despite the searchlights now swinging toward his position, cleared the top, dropped, ran into the scrubland beyond. He made it 3 miles before dogs picked up his trail, made it another 2 before exhaustion and blood loss forced him to stop. When the officers surrounded him at dawn, he was sitting under a pine tree, shirt wrapped around the worst of his wounds, looking almost peaceful. In engineering circles, they might call it elegant. The efficiency of the solution, the way he'd identified and exploited structural weaknesses that existed at the intersection of old and new construction. In prison administration circles, they called it a nightmare. Because if someone could escape from Florida State Prison by squeezing through ventilation ducts that weren't supposed to accommodate human bodies, what did that say about all their expensive security measures? Even the most brilliant patterns eventually attract the right kind of attention. And Mark DeFrest was about to discover that the attention he'd earned wasn't the kind anyone wanted. The fifth escape wasn't easier because Mark had practice. It was harder because they did too. The prison system had finally brought in specialists, people whose only job was to think like he did. Consultants who'd studied escape attempts across the country, who understood vulnerabilities in institutional design, who could anticipate creative solutions before inmates discovered them. They walked through facilities with fresh eyes, identifying the kinds of weaknesses Mark had been exploiting for years. Florida State Prison underwent a comprehensive security overhaul specifically designed with Mark DeFrest in mind. Ventilation ducts were retrofitted with internal barriers, steel plates welded at intervals that made traversing them impossible, regardless of how flexible you were. Cell searches became more thorough, more frequent, guards trained to recognize the subtle signs of long-term tampering. Tool inventories were conducted daily, with each item photographed, measured, accounted for with bureaucratic precision. Keys were redesigned with more complex patterns, making memorization and replication exponentially more difficult. They even brought in a psychologist who specialized in understanding compulsive behavior, trying to predict when Mark might attempt another escape based on behavioral patterns and stress indicators. Did he seem more withdrawn than usual? Was he eating less, sleeping differently? Every aspect of his daily existence became data to be analyzed, signs to be interpreted. For someone whose entire life had been a study in observation and pattern recognition, being the subject of such intense scrutiny created a strange inversion. He was watching them watch him, both sides trying to anticipate the other's next move in a game that had consumed years of everyone's lives. But here's the thing about people who've escaped 5 times already. They don't stop because it gets harder. If anything, increased difficulty becomes a kind of challenge, proof that the game is still worth playing. Mark's 5th escape attempt began with something he'd never had to rely on before: outside help. Not intentional help, nothing so organized as conspiracy, but the kind of assistance that comes from human error, from the small ways that even well-trained people make mistakes when they've been doing the same job for too long. A new guard had been assigned to Mark's unit, young, fresh out of training, eager to prove himself competent. The training had been thorough, the procedures drilled into him until they seemed second nature. But training prepares you for protocols, not for the subtle psychological pressure of being responsible for holding Florida's most famous escape artist. That pressure manifested in interesting ways. The guard became hyper-vigilant about certain things, triple-checking locks, examining Mark's cell with meticulous attention, following every rule exactly as written. But in his focus on obvious security measures, he missed smaller things. The way he positioned himself during searches created momentary blind spots. The route he walked during rounds followed a predictable pattern that left certain areas unwatched for consistent intervals, Mark noticed. Of course he noticed. The escape itself involved a method he'd used before, but with modifications forced by the new security measures. He couldn't replicate keys anymore. The new designs were too complex and he lacked access to materials that would hold the necessary detail. He couldn't use ventilation ducts, they'd been blocked. The fences had been upgraded with additional sensors. Every traditional route had been closed, so he found an untraditional one. The prison laundry system processed thousands of pounds of institutional clothing every week, sheets and uniforms and towels moving in industrial carts from cell blocks to the washing facility and back again. The carts themselves were large metal bins on wheels, filled to capacity with soiled linens. They were checked coming and going, guards using poles to probe the contents, making sure no one was hiding beneath the layers of cloth. But the checks were cursory. Quick jabs with a pole, visual scan of the top layer, then waved through. After all, who would be crazy enough to hide in a laundry cart filled with clothing contaminated by hundreds of inmates? Mark, apparently. He'd positioned himself at the very bottom of a cart during a brief moment when it sat unattended, compressed himself into a space that seemed too small to hold a human body, covered by successive layers of sheets and uniforms that absorbed and concealed his form. The weight on top of him was immense, making breathing difficult, each inhalation a struggle against cloth pressing down from all directions. The cart moved. He felt the wheels beneath him begin to turn, heard the guard conducting the search, felt the pole jab through the layers above him, missing his body by what might have been inches. The guard approved the cart for transit. Mark rode through 3 checkpoints, each one a gamble, each inspection an opportunity for discovery. At the laundry facility, the cart was supposed to be dumped mechanically, contents spilling, into industrial washing machines. If that happened while he was still inside, the escape would end in either capture or death by drowning in an industrial washer. He emerged from the cart during the brief window after it arrived, but before being processed, covered in other people's sweat and grime, gasping for air, every muscle cramped from the compressed position he'd maintained for over 30 minutes. Getting out of the laundry facility was its own challenge. The security was lighter here, focused on preventing inmates from accessing the area rather than preventing escapes from within it. Mark found a maintenance door that opened onto a loading dock. From there, a service road led to the outer perimeter. He was recaptured less than 8 hours later, picked up hitchhiking on Highway 301, heading north with no particular destination in mind beyond a way. 8 hours! That's all the fifth escape bought him. Not days, not even a full night. Just a handful of hours between when he cleared the prison grounds and when patrol cars surrounded him on a rural roadside. The escape had succeeded technically. He'd gotten out, defeated their enhanced security, proven that even their specialist consultants and new protocols couldn't hold him. But there was something different about this one. Something that showed in the photographs taken at his recapture. He looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. The toll of years spent fighting an institution that would never stop fighting back was beginning to show. 5 times they'd locked him up. 5 times he'd walked away. But the walls were closing in, metaphorically and literally, and even Mark must have known that the room for clever solutions was shrinking with each escape and recapture. The 6th escape would prove it. Desperation changes everything. Where previous escapes had been calculated, almost artistic in their execution, the 6th was raw survival. Mark was older now, weathered by years of solitary confinement, constant surveillance, and the accumulating damage that comes from spending your life fighting an institution designed to break you. He was 33, but looked older, the kind of aging that happens when stress compounds year after year without relief. The guards could see it too. The sharpness that had once defined his movements had dulled slightly. His eyes, which used to track every detail with laser focus, sometimes seemed distant, pulled inward to places they couldn't follow. The mechanical genius was still there. The ability to understand systems and exploit weaknesses hadn't vanished. But something else had changed. The patience that had characterized his earlier escapes, the willingness to wait months for the perfect moment, was giving way to something more urgent, more reckless. You have to understand what those years had done to him. 27 of the previous 34 years spent in solitary confinement. Not as punishment for violence. Mark had never seriously hurt anyone, but as a response to his escapes, to the embarrassment he'd caused, to the system's inability to control him through conventional means. Solitary confinement in Florida State Prison wasn't just isolation. It was sensory deprivation, psychological torture dressed up in bureaucratic language about security protocols, days that blended into each other without distinction. No windows, no natural light, No human contact beyond the guards who delivered meals through slots in the door. No books, no radio, no mental stimulation of any kind. Just concrete walls and fluorescent lights, and the slow erosion of the parts of your mind that need interaction, stimulus, purpose to remain healthy. Some people come out of solitary stronger, more determined. Others come out broken. Mark came out somewhere in between, still fighting, but fighting differently, with the desperation of someone who knows the walls are winning. The sixth escape happened in 1987, from a different facility where Mark had been transferred after his fifth recapture. The authorities kept moving him, hoping that unfamiliarity with the environment would slow down his planning. It did, but only slightly. Mark adapted to new facilities faster than security consultants could predict. This time, there was no elegant solution. No carefully replicated keys, no months-long observation of guard patterns, no brilliant exploitation of architectural quirks. This was brute force disguised as cleverness, desperation masquerading as planning. Mark had been assigned to a work detail in the prison's metal shop, one of the few privileges he'd retained despite his escape history. Someone had decided that keeping him occupied might reduce escape attempts, that giving him access to tools and materials under supervision was better than letting him sit idle in a cell creating tools from nothing. The logic was questionable, but bureaucracies operate on policies that sometimes contradict their own goals. In the metal shop, Mark had access to things he'd never had before. Actual tools, real metal, equipment designed for fabrication and construction. The supervision was supposed to be constant, but supervision is only as good as the humans providing it, and humans get tired, distracted, complacent. Over 2 weeks, Mark assembled what could generously be called an escape kit. Pieces of metal small enough to conceal, sturdy enough to be useful, a makeshift pry bar fashioned from a tool handle, wire that could be twisted into crude lockpicks. Nothing sophisticated, nothing that showed his usual finesse. These were tools born from desperation rather than craftsmanship. The escape itself was messy from the start. Mark used his pry bar to force open a maintenance access point during a shift change, something he would have accomplished more elegantly in earlier years. The metal shrieked against metal, the sound echoing through the facility in a way that should have drawn immediate attention. It didn't, but only because a fight had broken out in another cell block, pulling guards toward that distraction. He moved through service corridors that were supposed to be locked, forcing doors that resisted, leaving obvious marks of his passage. One door took him 3 minutes to breach, 3 minutes of exposed vulnerability when any passing guard would have caught him. He cut his hand badly on sharp metal during the process, blood making his grip slippery, pain making his movements less precise. The route to the outer fence involved crossing an open yard under partial illumination from security lights. Earlier, Mark would have found a way around this exposure, would have timed his crossing to coincide with guard rotations or light failures. This Mark just ran, gambling on speed rather than stealth. He made it to the fence, climbed with hands that were bleeding, muscles that were tired, a body that had been weakened by years of inadequate food and lack of real exercise. The razor wire at the top caught his clothing, tore deep gashes in his arms and legs. He fell from the fence rather than climbing down, landed hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs, possibly crack ribs, got up anyway, kept moving because stopping meant capture, and capture meant going back to that cell, to that isolation, to that slow death of everything that made you human. He made it perhaps 2 miles before the blood loss and exhaustion forced him to stop, collapsed in a drainage ditch beside a county road, unable to go farther, barely conscious when the dogs found him 30 minutes later. The recapture photos showed someone who looked less like an escape artist and more like a wounded animal. Cuts across his face and arms, prison uniform torn and soaked with blood, eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. He'd been free for less than 4 hours, spent most of that time crawling through scrubland trying to put distance between himself and the prison, knowing even as he did it that the distance was temporary, that they'd find him, that they always found him. 6 escapes, each one a little harder than the last. The pattern was changing, shifting from brilliant innovation to desperate flight. The man who'd once defeated Florida State Prison by squeezing through 10-inch ventilation ducts was now forcing doors with makeshift crowbars, bleeding his way over fences, collapsing in ditches. The authorities took note. Their reports documented his decline, noted the desperation in his methods, concluded that he was becoming less dangerous as he became more desperate. They were wrong about that last part, but they were right about the desperation. Whether the seventh escape would happen at all seemed uncertain. Mark had been moved to even more restrictive housing, his privileges stripped, his access to anything useful severely limited. The prison system felt confident that they'd finally broken him, finally reduced him to a point where escape was no longer possible. But Mark had never been one to accept walls as permanent. Even bleeding, exhausted, broken in ways both visible and not, some part of him was already thinking about the next attempt. Because staying captured wasn't living. It was just a slower form of dying. The seventh escape came when everyone, including possibly Mark himself, thought the story was over. The year was 1989. Mark was 29 years old but looked 50, his face lined with the kind of premature aging that comes from nearly a decade of solitary confinement. He'd been transferred back to Florida State Prison's X-Wing, the most restrictive unit in the facility, reserved for the most violent offenders, and somehow, for one non-violent man whose only real crime was refusing to stay locked up. The odds had never been worse. Mark was under 24-hour camera surveillance. His cell was stripped of everything except a concrete bunk and a toilet. No personal belongings, no work assignments, no access to common areas. He was fed through a slot in his door. His only human contact came during the brief moments when guards conducted searches or escorted him to solitary recreation, an hour alone in a slightly larger cage, which is precisely why it worked. The prison had invested so much energy into watching Mark, into preventing him from building tools or observing patterns, that they'd overlooked the most fundamental vulnerability in any system, the people operating it. You can have perfect protocols, but protocols require human implementation, and humans, no matter how well trained, carry with them all the weaknesses that make us human. The escape began with something Mark had been denied for years, a small kindness. A guard relatively new to the X-Wing assignment saw Mark sitting in his empty cell during a routine check. Maybe the guard was having a compassionate moment, or maybe he was just bored and wanted someone to talk to, but he stopped and asked Mark if he wanted a book to read. Nothing special, just something to pass the time. Mark said yes. The guard brought him a paperback western the next day, something worn and dog-eared that had been circulating through the facility for months. What the guard didn't know was that the book itself didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd broken protocol, established a pattern of small kindnesses that Mark could build on. Over the next week the guard brought other things, a magazine, a deck of cards. Each violation of the rules was minor, the kind of thing that seemed harmless in the moment but that created cracks in the otherwise impenetrable security. The cards were what Mark needed, not to play with, though he pretended to appreciate them, but because playing cards, even cheap prison-issue cards, are made of layered paper and plastic that can be separated, shaped, used in ways their manufacturers never intended. Over 2 weeks, Mark transformed those cards into a tool so simple it seemed almost absurd. A shim, essentially a thin, piece of rigid material that could be slipped between a door and its frame to manipulate the locking mechanism. The cards were perfect for this, stiff enough to maintain form, thin enough to fit into gaps measured in fractions of an inch, innocent enough that no one would think to confiscate them during searches. The door to his cell, for all the facility's modern security measures, still used a mechanical lock that could be shimmed by someone who understood exactly where to apply pressure. Mark had spent years studying locks, understanding their vulnerabilities at a level most locksmiths never achieve. This lock was newer than the ones in his earlier escapes, but the fundamental principle remained the same. He worked at night during the hours when surveillance was supposed to be most vigilant, but when tired guards often grew complacent. The cameras watched, but cameras only show what someone is looking for, and no one was looking for an inmate using playing cards to pick a lock on a door that was theoretically unpickable. It took him 3 hours of patient work, the shim inserted and removed and reinserted as he felt for the precise angle that would disengage the bolt. His hands, which had once been so precise, shook slightly from years of poor nutrition and the neurological damage that comes from extended isolation. But muscle memory persisted, and eventually at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning he felt the bolt slide back. The door opened, From there, the escape followed patterns he'd established years earlier, knowledge embedded so deeply it had become instinct. He knew which corridors would be least monitored at this hour, knew where service access points were located, knew that the roof remained the best exit because guard attention focused downward and outward, not up. He was over the fence and into the scrubland by 3:20 a.m., moving faster than he had during the 6th escape, adrenaline overcoming the physical deterioration that years of confinement had caused. This time, he made it 36 hours, a day and a half of freedom, walking through rural Florida, sleeping in abandoned buildings, moving at night when possible. He was picked up at a gas station outside Gainesville, using a payphone to call someone, anyone, though he never completed the call before the patrol car pulled into the lot. The officers who arrested him said later that he didn't resist, didn't run, just hung up the phone, turned around and put his hands behind his back as if he'd been expecting them. 7 escapes. 7 times he'd looked at walls that were supposed to be permanent and found them negotiable. 7 times he'd proven that intelligence and determination could defeat locks, guards, and institutional certainty. 7 times he'd chosen freedom, however brief, over acceptance of captivity. In numerology, 7 is a number of completion, of perfection, of cycles reaching their natural conclusion. Whether Mark knew this was his last successful escape isn't clear. Whether he planned it that way or whether circumstance simply decided for him remains unknown. But 7 times was enough to cement his legend, to ensure that decades later people would still tell his story, still marvel at the man who couldn't be held. The question that haunted everyone who knew his story wasn't how he escaped so many times. The question was why. Why risk everything over and over for freedom measured in hours or days? Why not just serve the time, accept the walls, wait for eventual release? But that question misses the point entirely. For Mark de Friest, staying captured wasn't an option his brain could process. It wasn't about the destination. It was about refusing to accept that anywhere was truly inescapable, that any authority was truly absolute. 7 locks broken. 7 times he chose autonomy over compliance. In the end, whether he won or lost depends entirely on how you measure victory. Numbers don't capture the whole story. What does it mean when one person refuses to stay captured? What does it say about the human spirit's stubborn refusal to accept limits, even when those limits are reinforced with steel and concrete and the full weight of institutional power? When Mark de Friest was finally granted parole on February 5, 2016, he walked out of prison after 34 years behind bars. He was 58 years old. The young man who'd once squeezed through 10-inch ventilation ducts was now greying, weathered, marked by decades of solitary confinement and the physical toll of a life spent fighting institutions designed to break him. He'd outlasted multiple wardens, seen prison systems modernize around him, watched generations of guards come and go. His original 4-year sentence for taking his father's tools had somehow stretched into more than 3 decades. 10 days later, he was arrested again. The failure wasn't dramatic. No escape attempt, no violence, just the predictable unravelling of someone who'd spent most of his adult life in cages trying to navigate a world that had moved on without him. Behavioural violations at the halfway house where he'd been placed. Drug tests showing substances he shouldn't have had access to. The kinds of mistakes that might be handled with counselling for someone else, but that, for Mark de Friest, meant immediate return to custody. As of this writing, he remains incarcerated, though in different facilities, under different circumstances, the specifics kept deliberately vague by a correction system that learned long ago not to advertise where it's holding Florida's most famous escape artist. His story left behind more than just a record. It left questions that still echo through prison reform discussions, legal debates about mental illness and incarceration, conversations about what justice actually means when the punishment extends so far beyond the crime that the original offence becomes almost irrelevant. Filmmaker Gabriel London spent 13 years documenting Mark's journey, creating a documentary called The Mind of Mark de Friest that brought his story to audiences who'd never heard of him. The film showed the escapes, yes, but also the abuse, the years in darkness, the systematic destruction of a human being by an institution that saw his intelligence as a threat rather than something that could be channeled toward anything productive. The documentary sparked petitions, advocacy campaigns, eventually contributing to the parole board's decision to reduce his sentence. But it also sparked harder conversations about how the prison system handles people whose brains work differently, who can't navigate social situations instinctively, but can memorize key patterns from a glance, or engineer escape routes from nothing. 5 of 6 psychiatrists who evaluated Mark over the years concluded he was mentally ill, incompetent to stand trial. The 6th, Dr. Robert Burland, said Mark was faking, that his behaviour was manipulative rather than symptomatic. Based largely on that single dissenting opinion, Mark was allowed to accept a plea deal that added decades to his sentence. Decades later, Burland reversed his assessment, admitted he'd been wrong, that what he'd interpreted as manipulation was actually untreated mental illness, probably autism spectrum disorder combined with other conditions that prison only made worse. But by then, the damage was done. The years couldn't be returned. The time in solitary couldn't be unspent. What did the prison system learn from Mark de Vriest? On paper, quite a lot. Security protocols were rewritten with his escapes in mind. Ventilation systems were redesigned. Key patterns became more complex. Surveillance increased. Training programs now include case studies of his methods, teaching guards to think like escape artists, to anticipate creative solutions to the problem of confinement. But the deeper lessons went mostly unlearned. The questions about whether a 4-year sentence should become 34 years because someone kept trying to leave, whether solitary confinement for decades constitutes torture, regardless of what you call it in official documents, whether the prison system is equipped to handle mental illness, or whether it just warehouses people who need treatment until they break or die or somehow survive despite the conditions. Mark's story became folklore in a way that makes some people uncomfortable. Among inmates, he's a legend. The man who proved that no prison is truly escape-proof if you're smart enough and stubborn enough. Among prison reform advocates, he's evidence of a system that's fundamentally broken, that punishes mental illness instead of treating it. Among corrections officials, he's a cautionary tale about the inmates who don't fit into any standard category of management. The public memory of Mark de Vriest splits along predictable lines. Some see a folk hero, a modern Houdini whose refusal to stay caged represents something admirable about human determination. Others see a criminal who deserved every year he served, who brought his extended sentence on himself through repeated violations. The truth, as usual, lives somewhere more complicated than either narrative allows. Today, when architects design maximum security facilities, Mark's escapes are studied as test cases. When prison psychologists assess inmates, his case appears in discussions about how mental illness intersects with institutional discipline. When advocates argue for prison reform, his name comes up as shorthand for everything wrong with a system that treats human beings like problems to be solved through isolation and restriction. His 7 successful escapes stand as a record that will probably never be broken, not because future inmates lack Mark's intelligence or determination, but because prison systems have adapted, learned, closed the kinds of vulnerabilities he exploited. In that sense, Mark's legacy is written into the architecture of every modern detention facility. Invisible, but permanent. But there's something else his story reveals, something harder to quantify or address through better locks and surveillance systems. It asks what we mean when we say someone has paid their debt to society. It questions whether the purpose of incarceration is punishment, rehabilitation, or simply removal of people we don't know how to help. It reminds us that behind every prisoner number is a human being with a story that's probably more complicated than the crime that put them there. Mark de Vriest's story stands as testament to something both inspiring and tragic. Inspiring because it shows what human ingenuity can accomplish, even in the most restrictive circumstances. Tragic because that ingenuity was spent on escaping rather than creating, on fighting walls rather than building anything lasting. In the end, his legacy isn't really about the escapes, it's about the questions that remain. Questions about freedom and constraint, about mental illness and punishment, about whether we're capable of seeing people as something more than the worst thing they've ever done. Questions that whisper through every prison yard, every locked door, every person counting days until release or until death, whichever comes first. Mark de Vriest proved that walls, whether made of steel or policy or institutional inertia, are always negotiable to someone determined enough. Not because escaping is right or wrong, admirable or criminal, but because the human spirit, stubborn and restless and impossibly resilient, refuses to accept that anywhere is truly permanent, that any lock is final, that any cage defines the limits of what we can become. One escape, one impossible solution, one refusal at a time.